Good morning. It is my great privilege to be with you today, and I want to begin, first of all, by bringing you greetings from the Reverend Dr. Terry Hoard Owens, who is our General Minister and President. She and her office represents the unity of who we are as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in some 3,000 congregations across the United States and Canada, many of them worshiping as we are this morning, and we give thanks for her leadership. We keep a common calendar in the office of General Minister and President, so we kind of know where each other are and can be aware of what's going on, and in part so we can pray for others as they are on the road and being with parts of our church. And I have it on good authority that Terry prays very hard for the places where she sees I am going. So I just want you to know that you are well prayed for this morning. I want to thank Pastor Melody for the invitation to preach today and the gift of the pulpit. I was always pretty picky about who I allowed space in worship to have the pulpit, and so the trust you have placed in me, I appreciate very much. And you can evaluate whether it was worth it or not when we're done. I come with a question this morning. What do you hope for? What do you hope for? I suspect there are a few of you are hoping that Anthony Richardson will turn the Colts' fortune around. Great draft pick, right? What do you hope for? Are you hoping for a beautiful lead-up weather-wise to the big race this year and a warm, dry day for the Indy 500? I know we're running a little horse race next weekend down where I come from, and I know that the weather is on people's mind. They're hoping for a really nice, dry day. And I can tell by looking at a few of you, you're hoping I don't preach too long, so perhaps we should move this along. I remember years ago the late Peter Gomes telling a story about a member of the British consulate who was being interviewed at the holiday time. You know how the networks kind of go out and do that, those kind of stories. And they were asking the different ambassadors, what are you hoping for the holidays? And this poor fella just sort of hemmed and hawed and cleared his throat, and finally he said, well, I guess I'm hoping for a jar of those wonderful fruit preserves like they have at Harrod's department store. Now, never mind that other foreign ambassadors were hoping for world peace or a cure for AIDS or an end to hunger, a little less hatred, a little more kindness. The biggest hope he seemed to be able to muster was jam for his morning toast. So I ask you, what do you hope for? I don't mean what do you wish for. I mean, really, what do you hope for? Because wishes are for jams and jellies and sunny days, for our activities, or for our sports teams to beat their rivals. But in the end, they really are of little consequence to the movement and flow of human history, right? It's nice when they come out our way, but yeah. And I dare say, church, sometimes I don't think we hope big enough, because hope has got to be strong enough for you to hang on to it when everything else around you seems to be falling away, when we've exercised all of our best case scenarios and hope is all we have left. I mean, we live in a world with a lot of complicated problems. Russia's invading Ukraine and now threatening a massive spring offensive. North Korea firing long-range missiles with nuclear capability over Japan with a clear message to us that they can get to us now. Concerns about the state of our democracy and the willingness to accept election results by those seeking office. Inflation, a shaky stock market, and honestly, I will tell you that more than any time in my lifetime, it seems as though our politicians are more interested in scoring points against each other than they are in doing anything for us or for the common good. It is a kind of a tough time. We live in a world where over 25,000 people die every day for lack of access to clean water or simple medications or adequate food supply. I mean, we need more than some wishing here, right? We need some real hope. Hope that's something beyond ourselves, bigger and greater than ourselves. A few years ago when I was traveling, I had the opportunity to visit a museum that was dedicated to Native American art. I don't know if this has ever happened to you or not, but when I walked in this case, it was a large narthex area, and on the wall, as you kind of walked in on the right side, was this beautiful weaving that was several stories in height. I mean, it was a massive weaving. And I just sort of was taken back by it, and I turned to the person next to me. Maybe you've done this before, and I just said, "Gosh, isn't that pretty?" Well, her head snapped around, and she said, "Pretty? Pretty in weaving it's a sacred art for the Native Americans." She said it embodies creation stories and the ancient and historical past. She said in weaving, the individual preserves the hoso, the concept that combines beauty and balance and order. And gosh, I thought it was pretty. And she wasn't done. She said, as you look at it, do you see in the center of it a brilliant scarlet thread? She said, in some places it's easier to see than others. It sort of tucks beneath the fabric, but it starts at the bottom and ends at the top with this great flourish. She said, I think that's the hope of the people. Gosh, I thought it was pretty. But it did get me to thinking. Isn't the Bible sort of a weaving of sacred stories woven around a thread of hope? Isn't there this sense of a loving creator and a rebellious creation ultimately being reconciled, and it really will be on earth as it is in heaven? Aren't there moments where it's bright on the fabric and easy to see, and other moments where it tucks behind and we're not sure it's still there? I mean, I think of the stories early in the Bible. I think of Abram and Sarai, the promise that they would be heirs to a great nation, numbering more than the stars in the sky. The hope is pretty bright there until we learn a few things, a few details, that Sarai is old and past childbearing age. The joy of having children with you in worship. When I preached on this Sarah and Abram story many years ago, my oldest son was probably junior high age, and he looked at his mother just loud enough for everyone else in the sanctuary to hear, Well, if they were buying diapers, it wasn't for babies. And he was kind of right. I mean, they were old and wrinkly and pruny, and I kind of know how they feel. But God does this remarkable thing. Right when the thread seems behind the fabric where it's disappeared, we hear that Sarah gives birth to a child named Isaac, which in Hebrew means laughter. And the hope pops back up. The thread reappears where we can see it. Think of the stories of Moses and the children of Israel, the deliverance at the Red Sea. The hope was pretty pinned down for a while as they were in slavery in Egypt. And then Pharaoh finally's had enough after the 10th plague and sends them out, and the hope starts to appear again. That thread is pretty bright. We can see it until they get to the Red Sea. And with their backs against the Red Sea and Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen thundering toward them, hope seems to be disappearing. But God does this remarkable thing, and the waters part according to the story, and the children of Israel pass across dry land, and then the waters sweep over the threat of returning to slavery. Even as they're taking the promised land, they come to the great walled city of Jericho. Again, hope is looking pretty good until they get there. But remember that story? There are a couple spies go into the city, and they meet, of all people, a harlot, a prostitute named Rahab. And they promise her in exchange for her help, if she lets down a crimson cord, a scarlet thread, if you will, from her window in the wall, that she will be saved when the city falls. And sure enough, the children of Israel marched around the city for 7 days, blew the shofar, the ram's horn, and God did this remarkable thing. According to the story, the city fell. And you know, if you look in the lineage of Jesus, whose name you will find? Rahab. So it is, as moments when the thread of hope seems tucked beneath the fabric. In barrenness for Hannah or Elizabeth, we get Samuel and John the Baptist. In moments of despair, the prophets hold out hope that the world might be someday as God imagines it to be, with people doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. And then we get to the life of Jesus, where surely the thread is the brightest it could possibly be. Through his teaching, through his ministry of healing, through his openness and welcome, through his challenge to his assurance of God's love, that is bright on the fabric. Until that moment where he hangs between heaven and earth on the cross, and it looks as though the thread will be cut here. But God does this remarkable thing. And on the third day, Jesus is raised to life, the assurance that God's love for us is stronger even than death itself. And the thread of hope is where we can see it, bright on the fabric. And when we get to the story of Tabitha today, which you've now heard twice, and I'm going to tell it to you one more time because I want to be sure you get it. We get to the story of Tabitha. We're in the book of Acts, a place where over and again the thread of hope seems to go in and out beneath the fabric, and sometimes popping and then sometimes disappearing again. Think about it. When Jesus ascends into heaven, the church is left with the question, now what? The thread seems to be in some trouble, right? What will happen now that Jesus has left the building? But over and over, the book of Acts tells us stories about how the Spirit of Jesus is still present in the early church through the work of the apostles, and this is one of those stories. You heard it twice, now for the third time. There was a disciple. Let me say that again. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha. The Greek word here is the same one that's ascribed to all those fellas who followed Jesus. I just want to make that clear. Why we have ever fussed about women in leadership in the church is a real question to me, because this is the same term. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, in the Greek Dorcas. Now that's unfortunate. Well, you know, there's another way to translate that word. You can translate that word, instead of Dorcas, you can translate that word gazelle. There was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, in the Greek gazelle, who was dedicated to good works and acts of charity. You see, she has a backstory, and we can't let that get away from us as the story unfolds. She has been making these garments for the women in the community, the widows, those who, there was no Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid. There were no structures in the fabric of the culture of the time that provided for a widow or an orphan. If they had no family, they were on their own. It was up to the largesse of someone in the community to take care of them. And this is what Tabitha Gazelle is doing. And they're not simply utilitarian. They're beautiful. They are beautiful garments. They give dignity to the person who wears them. And we hear now that Tabitha has died. The thread has gone beneath the fabric. There's a crisis in the church. What will happen now? Who will take care of these folks? They hear that Peter is nearby, and they summoned him, and he came. Her body was in an upper room. Now that sounds familiar, doesn't it? And he put everyone out. You heard the story. He prayed. Now, we won't skip over that immediately, because I'm sure you've noticed. You look like folks who've read the Bible before. You probably have noticed in the Gospel of Luke that before Jesus does anything big, he prays. And in the book of Acts, that's repeated by the church and the apostles before anything big happens. Remember, Pentecost, we're about to celebrate it in a few weeks. They were in the upper room, but they were at prayer, right? Every time something big is about to happen, somebody is praying first. There's probably a message there for the church we ought to remember. He prays, and then he looks at Tabitha and says, "Get up." And she does. This is a resurrection story. Here we are in Eastertide, in the season of celebrating resurrection. And the book of Acts gives us this story today. This beautiful story about the power of Jesus, the resurrection power of Jesus, still at work in the church, even though Jesus is physically gone. And I think that is probably Luke's primary purpose in telling the story. The power of Jesus can still raise the dead. But I hear something else in the story. Because let's be honest, if the point is just to raise a dead body, any dead body would have done, right? Surely there were plenty around. Just go to one of those. But Peter doesn't just go to one of those. It isn't just any dead body. It's Tabitha who was raised to life, which I hear Luke telling us as the author of Acts, that church can't be church without being like Tabitha, without being dedicated to good works and acts of charity. That was her gift, and the church was incomplete without it. Hope starts to reappear on the fabric, right? God will not abandon the widow, the orphan, the disenfranchised, the alien. In the New Testament, these things are just as important to God as they were in the First Testament. You know, generosity has a lot of power. It's not easy to practice generosity. I want to be fair about that, because real generosity demands something of us. It's over and above the usual. It is an expression that suggests that we give something more than we might feel we can afford in order to be generous. So you can really only practice generosity if you let go of your fear, because with fear comes a little bit of faith, right? You let go of your despair, maybe it can be replaced with hope. With faith comes trust. With trust comes courage. With courage comes the ability to take a risk. And with the willingness to risk comes the possibility of change. And with the possibility of change, there's hope for a different future from our present circumstance. That's the power of the thread of hope. And you know, I've seen the thread of hope in different places. I'm sure that you have too. I once saw the thread of hope in all places in some rebar sticking up from some cinder blocks in Guatemala in a place called La Isla. Now, La Isla sounds like, boy, that was a pretty nice place to have a mission trip, right? The island. Well, the problem is that it wasn't anywhere near the shore. It was south of Guatemala City, and La Isla is an island made of garbage that fills up a valley just to the south of Guatemala City. And there are people who live and worship in the garbage. We worshiped there with them one Sunday under tattered tarps, keeping the hot sun off our face, in a squared out area with cinder block that had rebar, where they were hoping that they could put a roof on this sanctuary. Here in the middle of the garbage dump, they had built a church. In the midst of their poverty, they lived amongst the garbage, pulling out broken cinder block and 2x4s and corrugated metal to make homes. This was extreme poverty, but they had not lost hope in the presence of God in their midst. And to share with you just how extreme the poverty was, after the service, we got a chance to go into one of these sort of hovels that a family was living in. And it didn't take me very long to get kind of agitated because in the corner of this shack was a baby, about 6 months old, surrounded by layer after layer of chicken wire. That was its crib. And so through the translator, I asked, why the chicken wire? Through which the father replied, that's to protect the baby from the rats. And yet these people somehow had not lost hope. The thread of hope looks different in different places. You're weaving with the thread of hope in a mission we share together with our friends in the United Church of Christ in global missions with a woman named Rose. And do you know what Rose does with the little bit of money she receives from Disciple Mission Fund and the church's wider ministry money from the United Church of Christ? She runs a place called the Samaritan Care Center in Buffalo Flats, South Africa, where she takes the dying in off the street. There are people who've been put out by their families because they're dying of HIV/AIDS. Their families want nothing to do with them, but she takes them essentially, they call it the Samaritan Care Center, it's really her home, and brings them in and offers them the love and compassion of Jesus Christ as they draw their last breath so they don't die alone. The thread of hope looks different in different places. I suspect it looks like a thread that runs through your basement, the I Can food pantry, where people here in Irvington know they can get a meal and have another day secured for them in a world that otherwise to them feels unsustainable. It might look like Family Promise, a thread of hope you're offering to homeless people who are transitioning into real housing and have a chance for a real future. And you make that possible with your generosity. You offer a thread of hope at Trinity Haven, where gay, lesbian, bi, and trans youth who've been thrown out by their families, turned away by the very people who should love them most, have been denied and rejected, and you have said, God loves you and you matter for who you are. You have given them a thread of hope with your generosity. Sometimes it might be just fun. A thread of hope in pickleball, where the community can gather together remembering that we are spirit, mind, and body. And you make your space available for folks to celebrate that and make new friendships and relationships. And sometimes it really is a thread. My wife Laura is a cancer survivor, and when she was diagnosed, the women in her CWF circle bought skeins of yarn and knitting needles, and you can imagine they knitted her a prayer blanket, and we know it went from house to house, and we know that every place that the knitting looks a little different because, you know, some were a little better with the needles than others, that's a place where we as a family were prayed for as we sought to give care, where she was prayed for as she went through treatment. And can I tell you something about that? It's the warmest blanket in the house. Because our hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness, we dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name, because it's on Christ, the solid rock, we stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Through the practice of generosity, God has placed in your hand a thread of hope. What will you dare to weave with it?